The locked psychiatric unit door closed behind me 43 minutes after my wife told an emergency physician I had threatened to kill myself. I had never threatened to kill myself. I had never threatened anyone. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting at our kitchen table showing Dr. Lillian Mallory why more than 200 doses of fentanyl could not be accounted for inside Briarwood Memorial, the hospital where she worked. Now a nurse was asking me to remove my belt and shoelaces. "Mr. Mallory, I need your phone too. My attorney's number is in it. You can make calls after intake." "Am I here voluntarily?" She checked the chart on her tablet. "No. The emergency physician placed you on a behavioral health hold pending psychiatric evaluation." "What behavior supposedly made me dangerous?" "You'll need to discuss that with psychiatry." I looked through the narrow window in the secured door. Lillian stood on the other side of the hallway in navy scrubs, speaking quietly with another doctor. She did not look frightened. She looked relieved. That was when I stopped wondering whether this had been a catastrophic misunderstanding. My wife wanted me contained. The nurse held out a clear plastic property bag. "Phone, please." I unlocked it first. "Sir, I need you to hand it over." "1 second." I opened the Arkwell Clinical Data app and entered my incident credentials. Arkwell was the medical systems company I had founded 9 years earlier. We built reconciliation software that compared automated dispensing cabinets, pharmacy vaults, anesthesia medication records, and electronic charts so hospitals could detect discrepancies before they became patient safety events. A warning appeared. Controlled substance integrity event. I selected preserve source records and confirmed. The app created a read-only snapshot of the relevant transaction history and extended the underlying retention period. That was not a secret copy of patient charts. It was a standard contractual safeguard Arkwell used when controlled substance data suggested possible diversion or tampering. I handed the phone over. Through the glass, Lillian's expression changed. She knew exactly what I had done. 4 hours earlier, the situation had looked almost ordinary. Arkwell's monitoring team had flagged a reconciliation failure on Briarwood's surgical floors. Most discrepancies were mundane: damaged barcodes, delayed charting, wasted medication recorded incorrectly, cabinets temporarily offline. This one was different. 37 fentanyl transactions over 11 weeks appeared in anesthesia documentation but failed to reconcile cleanly against pharmacy inventory. She had called me because the transactions shared an unusual pattern. Every one involved the same anesthesiologist, Dr. Brett Kavanaugh, Lillian's ex-boyfriend. They had dated in medical school, years before she met me. I had never cared. Brett had been married twice since then, and Lillian and I had been together for 9 years. What caught my attention was not their history. It was the timestamps. Medication was being removed under legitimate cases, but portions of the documented waste were not matching the pharmacy's controlled substance records. Several transactions showed fentanyl pulled for procedures that used less than expected, followed by corrected waste entries hours later. Then Rena found badge access anomalies. Some pharmacy reconciliation edits had been made after midnight using Brett's credentials from terminals outside the operating suites. I called Lillian because she was Briarwood's vice chair of emergency medicine and served on the hospital's medication safety committee. I expected her to tell me to notify pharmacy compliance immediately. Instead, she came home early. She read the summary on my laptop without sitting down. "How many transactions?" 37 confirmed. "Maybe more." "How much fentanyl?" "Enough that this cannot be written off as sloppy waste documentation." Her eyes moved down the page. "Who else has this?" "Rena." "2 engineers." "Nobody at Briarwood yet." "Keep it that way tonight." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because Brett has a problem." The sentence changed the room. "What kind of problem?" She sat across from me. "Opioids." "How long have you known?" "A few months." I closed the laptop halfway. "He told you?" "Yes." "And you never reported it?" "He told me he was using pills after a shoulder injury. He said he had stopped." "Fentanyl isn't leftover pain medication." "I know." "How long have you known he was taking drugs from the hospital?" "I didn't know that." "Did you suspect it?" Lillian looked toward the window. "That was enough." "How long?" "Gavin, please." "How long?" 3 weeks. I felt something cold move through me. "You've suspected controlled drug diversion for 3 weeks." I suspected he relapsed. "At work." "I didn't know where he was getting it." And when I showed you the fentanyl records? Her eyes filled. I understood. I opened the laptop again. Then I'm notifying Briarwood compliance. She reached across the table and pushed the screen down. Wait until tomorrow. No. Just one night. What happens tomorrow? He has a bed at a physician treatment program. I stared at her. You arranged treatment? I helped. Before you knew about the fentanyl? Yes. That explained why she was so desperate. Brett had apparently admitted the relapse to her privately. Lillian had spent weeks trying to move him toward treatment without triggering a formal hospital diversion case. He checks in tomorrow morning, she said. If this report hits tonight, security pulls him from the schedule, police may get involved immediately, and he may refuse treatment completely. He's an anesthesiologist stealing fentanyl. I know what he is doing is serious. Then stop talking like the main risk is whether he feels embarrassed enough to skip rehab. Her face hardened. You don't understand physician impairment. I understand controlled substances. He needs treatment. And Briarwood needs to know drugs are disappearing. I am asking for 12 hours. Those 12 hours include patients. He is not working tonight. Are you sure? Yes. How? I checked. That answer bothered me. You checked his schedule before coming home. She did not deny it. Lillian had already moved from helping a former friend into managing exposure. I stood and reopened the laptop. I'm filing the integrity notice. She stepped in front of me. If you do this tonight, you destroy him before he has a chance to get help. No. I report evidence. What happens after that depends on what he did. You think systems make everything clean? No. I think hospitals should know when fentanyl is missing. She started crying. He almost died last month. I stopped. What? He overdosed in his apartment. I found him. How? He called me. At home? Yes. Did you take him to an emergency department? No. I stared at her. What did you do? I stayed with him. I had naloxone in my car. Every new answer made the situation worse. You treated an overdose privately and didn't report that an anesthesiologist was impaired? He wasn't on shift. That isn't the point. He begged me. And you chose him. That's not fair. It's exactly what happened. She wiped her face. I was trying to get him into treatment without ending his career. I picked up my phone. I'm calling Briarwood's compliance hotline. Lillian grabbed my wrist. Please. I pulled free. Do not touch me. She stepped back immediately. For a second I saw the doctor in her recognize what she had just done. Then I called Arkwell's incident line first because I needed our source logs preserved before Briarwood changed access to the system. Rena answered. Gavin? Convert the Briarwood anomaly into a formal controlled substance integrity event. Lillian's face went white. Rena asked, hospital notification? Prepare it. Do not transmit until I call back. Understood. I ended the call. That was my first irreversible decision. The data could no longer disappear through routine retention, corrections, or account changes. Arkwell's compliance protocol now required documented closure. Lillian whispered, You have no idea what you just did. I know exactly what I did. She left the kitchen. I thought she was going upstairs. Instead she called someone. I heard only pieces. He's not sleeping. No, this is different. He thinks Brett is stealing narcotics. Then my name. My heart started pounding. I walked into the living room. Who are you calling? She turned away. Lillian. She ended the call. What did you tell them? You need to calm down. Who was that? The emergency department. I stared at her. You called your own hospital? You've been awake almost 30 hours. Because Arkwell had spent the night debugging Briarwood's reconciliation failure. You're furious, you're not thinking clearly, and you keep talking like everyone is conspiring to protect Brett. I have transaction logs. I know. Then what exactly is delusional? She said nothing. My phone rang. Unknown number. I ignored it. Then headlights appeared outside. A police cruiser. A second vehicle behind it belonged to Briarwood's mobile crisis team. I looked at Lillian. What did you say? Her face collapsed. I told them you said if I protected Brett, there was no point in going on. I never said that. You said, if our marriage means this little, what's the point? That was about us. I heard it differently. No, you didn't. 2 officers came to the door with a crisis clinician. Lillian told them I had not slept, had become fixated on a drug theft theory involving her former boyfriend, had been increasingly agitated, and had made a statement she interpreted as suicidal. She also told them I owned a handgun. That part was true. Locked in a safe upstairs. I explained the medication records. I offered to show them the Arkwell incident. The crisis clinician listened, then asked whether I had access to the alleged data because of my company. Yes. Has the hospital confirmed the theft? Not yet. So at this moment, the accusation has not been independently verified. Correct. That was the trap. I had real evidence, but I was the only person in the room claiming what it meant. Lillian was a respected physician telling them I was sleep-deprived, emotionally unstable, armed, and making suicidal statements. The clinician did not declare me insane. She said I needed an emergency evaluation. I could either go voluntarily or be transported under the state's emergency mental health process based on the reported self-harm concern. I looked at Lillian. You know I'm not suicidal. She was crying now. I know you're not yourself. That sentence ended our marriage before any court paperwork ever could. I went voluntarily because fighting police in my living room would only strengthen what she had already told them. At Briarwood, another emergency physician, not Lillian, evaluated me. I denied suicidal intent. Denied hallucinations. Denied any plan to harm Brett. Explained the data discrepancy. He documented everything. Then Lillian spoke to him privately. 20 minutes later he signed the temporary hold for psychiatric assessment. Now I was sitting behind a locked door while my wife stood outside. My phone, wallet, keys, and belt were sealed in plastic. But the source data was preserved. That was the only thing she had not managed to take from me. I spent the night answering the same questions calmly. Was I suicidal? No. Had I threatened Brett? No. Did I believe people were conspiring against me? I believed my wife had concealed evidence that her former boyfriend might be diverting fentanyl. Could that belief be wrong? Yes. The record still required investigation. That answer made the psychiatrist look up. At 8:10 the next morning, Dr. Harriet Boone sat across from me with my chart open. You understand that being wrong about the drug data would not automatically mean you're psychotic. Yes. And being right would not automatically prove your wife acted maliciously in requesting evaluation. Yes. She studied me. You're very careful. I build systems where people get hurt when words become assumptions. She asked permission to call Rena at Arkwell. I gave it. 20 minutes later she returned. Your company confirms a formal controlled substance integrity event was created before you arrived here. Yes. They also confirm the anomaly predates your argument with your wife. Yes. Dr. Boone closed the chart. I do not find evidence that you currently meet criteria for continued involuntary psychiatric detention. For the first time in almost 18 hours, I could breathe properly. When can I leave? After discharge processing. Then she added, Mr. Mallory, I strongly recommend you have no direct contact with Dr. Kavanaugh and very limited contact with your wife until the underlying allegations are independently reviewed. I agree. At 10:26, the secure door opened. My shoelaces came back. My belt came back. My phone came back. I walked into the hospital lobby and saw Rena waiting for me. She looked furious. What happened? I'll explain outside. She didn't move. Gavin, Briarwood suspended Arkwell's system access at 7 this morning. I stopped. Why? They're accusing us of unauthorized extraction of controlled substance records. That's absurd. Our preservation clause. I know. She handed me a printed notice. The hospital claimed my personal involvement created a conflict because Lillian worked there and Brett was someone I knew socially. Until an independent review determined whether I had misused privileged system access, Arkwell could not connect to Briarwood's live environment. My release should have felt like the first thing going right. Instead, the only evidence strong enough to expose Brett had just been reframed as something I might have obtained improperly. Rena lowered her voice. There's more. What? Briarwood Compliance says Dr. Kavanaugh reported his badge stolen 3 weeks ago. I looked at her. The midnight edits had been made with Brett's credentials. If he claimed someone else had used them, the logs no longer pointed cleanly to him. Did he report the badge stolen when it happened? No. When? 7:12 this morning. Less than an hour before Arkwell was locked out. While I was still behind the psychiatric unit door. I looked back toward the hospital entrance. Lillian had bought Brett the one thing she had asked me for at our kitchen table. Time. And while I was locked away, they had used it. The first thing I did after leaving Briarwood was remove myself from Arkwell's investigation. Rena stared at me across the hood of her car. You founded the company. That's exactly why I can't touch this now. Gavin, they locked us out after your wife had you committed. If you step away, it looks like you did something wrong. If I stay involved, Brett's attorney gets to say every technical conclusion came from an angry husband. That was already happening. Briarwood's suspension letter did not accuse Arkwell of falsifying data. It questioned whether I had exceeded legitimate access while investigating someone tied to my marriage. If I personally analyzed another log, exported another file, or contacted another hospital employee, Brett would have a reason to attack the evidence instead of answering it. I called our outside counsel, Naomi Kerrigan, from the parking lot. By noon, Arkwell had appointed an independent incident lead and hired Halberd Digital Medicine, a healthcare forensics firm we had used twice before when our own systems needed outside scrutiny. I gave Halberd no conclusions. Only the sealed snapshot identifier, the contract provisions governing retention, and the names of the hospital systems involved. Then I signed a written recusal. It hurt. Arkwell was my company. I had designed the first version of the reconciliation engine myself. Being told I should not touch a problem inside my own software felt like watching someone else drive my car because I had become evidence in the accident. It was still the right move. Rena, read the recusal before I sent it. You understand that if Briarwood terminates us over this, the account is 11% of annual revenue. I know. That was enough loss for one morning. Briarwood alone employed 14 Arkwell people full-time. Keep everybody assigned, I said. No layoffs, no client migration until we know whether the suspension is temporary. That costs us money. Yes. What if this takes 6 months? Then we reassess before 6 months. Rena nodded. She did not make me promise anything heroic. At 1:20, Naomi obtained the hospital's written explanation for suspending Arkwell. The language was careful. Because I had a personal relationship with both Dr. Mallory and Dr. Kavanaugh, Briarwood believed any investigation touching controlled substance records required independent validation before Arkwell personnel resumed production access. That part was defensible. The next paragraph was not. It stated that the hospital had received clinical information raising questions about Mr. Mallory's judgment and perception during the period in which the alleged anomalies were identified. I read it twice. They're using the psychiatric hold. Naomi nodded. Indirectly. I was discharged after the psychiatrist found no basis to keep me. I know. Then why is that in a technical access letter? Because someone gave compliance enough information to think your mental state was relevant. Only a small number of people knew why I had been evaluated. Lillian. The emergency physician. The crisis clinician. Psychiatry. Possibly hospital risk management. Medical information did not simply belong in a vendor dispute because my wife happened to be a doctor there. Can we find out who disclosed it? Yes, but not today. I put the letter down. What matters today? Making sure the evidence survives and making sure you stop giving anyone reasons to call this a marital fight. That meant no call to Lillian. No confrontation with Brett. No angry email to Briarwood's chief medical officer. I went home instead. The house looked exactly as it had the night before. My coffee mug remained beside the sink. One dining chair was angled away from the table where Lillian had pushed my laptop closed. The handgun safe upstairs was still locked. Police had never opened it because I voluntarily gave them the key and they confirmed the weapon had not been touched. I photographed the safe log anyway. Then I packed a bag. Lillian came home while I was carrying it downstairs. She stopped in the entryway. You're leaving? Yes. Where? Hotel. Her eyes moved to the bag, then to my face. Gavin, can we talk? About what? Last night. I waited. She set her purse down. I panicked. You told a crisis team I was suicidal. I believed you were in a dangerous state. No, you believed I was about to report Brett. Her face tightened. Both things can be true. Not in this case. You had been awake almost 30 hours. You were angry. You were talking about destroying someone's career. I said I was notifying compliance. You said Brett was finished. Because stealing fentanyl usually damages an anesthesiologist's career. Lillian rubbed her forehead. I'm not defending the diversion. You still call it diversion when you talk to me. What does that mean? It means you believe the data. She realized where I was going. I believe he may have taken medication. Did he tell you? No. Did he ask you to get me evaluated? Her answer came quickly. No. That surprised me. Did he know you were calling the crisis team? No. Did you tell him afterward? She hesitated. Yes. When? This morning. What time? Around 6:30. Brett reported his badge stolen at 7:12. I did not need to accuse her of coordinating anything. The timeline was enough to make the question obvious. What did you tell him? That you had found discrepancies under his credentials and that Arkwell had preserved them. Lillian looked sick as soon as the words left her mouth. You warned him. I told him because I was trying to get him to surrender his privileges and enter treatment before security showed up. Then 40 minutes later he reported his badge stolen. I didn't know he was going to do that. I believed her. That made her decision worse in a different way. She had not helped Brett invent the defense. She had handed him the information he needed to create one. Did he go to treatment? No. Where is he? I don't know. Is he scheduled today? He was removed from clinical duty. By whom? Chief of Anesthesia. So Briarwood was taking the diversion concern seriously even while challenging my access. That distinction mattered. Lillian stepped closer. I know what I did last night was wrong. Which part? Calling the crisis team the way I did. The way you did? I should have told them exactly what you said instead of what I thought you meant. You told them I threatened suicide. Her eyes filled. Yes. I didn't. I know. That was the first clean admission. It did not fix anything. Did you tell the emergency physician that you already knew about Brett's opioid problem? Lillian looked down. No. Why? Because then he would have understood why you were angry. There it was. She had not merely misinterpreted me in panic. She withheld context that would have made my behavior look rational. I set my bag on the floor. When you told them I was fixated on a drug theft theory, you knew I had shown you actual hospital reconciliation data. Yes. And you didn't tell them. No. I felt calmer than I expected. Maybe because the worst part was finally specific. You used your credibility as a physician to make my evidence sound like a symptom. Lillian started crying. I was trying to buy time for Brett to get help. You bought him time with my freedom. She did not answer. There was nothing useful left to say. I picked up my bag. She asked, Are you filing for divorce? Not today. Hope appeared too quickly on her face. I stopped it. I'm not making that decision while I'm still angry enough to enjoy hurting you. The hope disappeared. Where does that leave us? Separate. I walked out. At 4:05, Halberd's lead examiner called Naomi and Rena. I listened but did not participate. The sealed Arkwell snapshot was intact. No post-preservation changes had altered the captured records. More importantly, Brett's newly reported badge loss did not explain everything. Briarwood used one credential for building access and another authentication method for medication systems. The midnight reconciliation edits had been made using Brett's account credentials from 3 different terminals. A stolen badge could explain someone entering a restricted area. It could not, by itself, explain his medication system logins. That still did not prove Brett personally typed them. Passwords could be shared or compromised. Halberd needed workstation logs, network records, and the hospital's authentication history. Briarwood had blocked Arkwell from collecting them. Naomi asked, Can the hospital destroy those records under normal retention? Some workstation logs rotate in 14 days, the examiner said. That created the first urgent legal problem after my release. Not exposing Brett. Preserving evidence Briarwood itself controlled while the hospital questioned whether Arkwell had the right to investigate. Naomi sent a formal demand that afternoon requesting an independent escrow of the relevant logs. Briarwood agreed within 2 hours. That told me its lawyers understood how bad destruction would look. At 6:30, the hospital also placed Brett on emergency suspension from patient care pending controlled substance review. For one moment, it looked as though the system was finally moving in the right direction. Then Naomi received a letter from Brett's attorney. He denied stealing fentanyl. He said his credentials had been compromised. He also alleged that I had become obsessed with his past relationship with my wife and had used privileged technical access to manufacture a case against him after learning Lillian was helping him through addiction treatment. The letter cited my psychiatric detention. That part was expected. The next part was not. Brett claimed Lillian had told him months earlier that I was jealous of their renewed contact and had become increasingly suspicious. I called her immediately. So much for limited contact. Did you tell Brett I was jealous of him? Lillian went quiet. When? Did you? I said our marriage was under strain because he was calling me too often. That isn't the same thing. I may have said you were uncomfortable with our history. Was I? No. Did I ever tell you to stop speaking to him? No. Did I ever accuse you of sleeping with him? No. Then why tell him I was jealous? She took a long breath. Because he was ashamed of needing help from me. I did not understand. What does my supposed jealousy have to do with his shame? He kept saying he was ruining my marriage. I told him you were reacting to our history, not to him being an addict. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed. You used me to make him feel better. I didn't think it would matter. It matters now. Brett had a ready-made explanation for why I would target him. Lillian had given it to him months before I found the first missing dose. That did not mean she planned what happened. It meant she had been protecting him in small ways long before she used the psychiatric system against me. At 8:17, Naomi called again. The independent escrow started. Good. Halberd found something before the copy finished. What? One of Brett's medication system passwords was reset 6 weeks ago. So? The reset did not come from IT. I sat up. How? Physician self-service recovery. It requires 2 factors. His phone? One factor was his phone. And the other? Naomi hesitated. A recovery approval from a medical staff administrator. I knew enough about Briarwood to understand what that meant. Senior physicians with administrative roles could validate identity when clinical staff were locked out of systems. Who approved it? Lillian. The room went quiet around me. 6 weeks earlier, while she already knew Brett had relapsed, my wife had helped restore his access to the system now showing missing fentanyl. That did not prove she knew he was stealing drugs. It did mean the story had moved beyond one panicked lie in our kitchen. I called her back. This time she answered with, I know why you're calling. You approved Brett's credential reset. Yes. Why? He called me at 2 in the morning before an emergency case. He said he was locked out. Were you at the hospital? No. Did you verify his identity? I knew it was him. That isn't what I asked. Silence on the line. Lillian, did you know he had relapsed by then? Yes. I closed my eyes. Did you know he was scheduled to administer controlled substances that night? Yes. Her voice broke. I thought getting him through the case and into treatment afterward was safer than blowing up an emergency surgery at 2 in the morning. There it was again. Delay the consequence. Protect the immediate outcome. Trust yourself to fix the danger afterward. Did he enter treatment afterward? No. And you still didn't report him? No. I ended the call. For the first time since leaving the psychiatric ward, I understood what I needed to prove. Brett might have stolen the fentanyl. Lillian might never have touched a vial. But if she knowingly helped an impaired anesthesiologist regain clinical system access and then used a false suicide claim to stop me from reporting what I found, her problem was no longer simply that she loved the wrong person too much. It was what she had been willing to risk to keep his collapse private. Briarwood restored Arkel's access 48 hours after I left the psychiatric unit, but I was not allowed to touch the account. That was the compromise everyone could live with. Halberd Digital Medicine had independently verified the sealed snapshot, confirmed that Arkel's preservation protocol was authorized under our hospital contract, and found no evidence that I had altered source records or created the anomalies myself. Briarwood's lawyers withdrew the accusation of unauthorized extraction, though they kept my personal recusal in place while the investigation continued. Rena called me from the conference room after the decision. 14 people get to keep working. I know. You sound disappointed. I'm relieved. I just hate that my own company needs permission to believe me. It doesn't. The hospital needed permission to believe itself. That was probably healthier. Arkwell returned to Briarwood under independent supervision. Halberd controlled the diversion analysis, and every request for additional data went through the hospital's outside counsel. I stayed out. Brett remained suspended from clinical duty. Lillian lasted one more day. Briarwood removed her from the Medication Safety Committee and placed her on paid administrative leave from her vice chair position while outside reviewers examined 3 separate issues. what she knew about Brett's impairment, why she had approved his credential recovery after learning he had relapsed, and whether her involvement in my emergency psychiatric evaluation created a professional conflict. The hospital did not suspend her medical license. It could not. That belonged to the state medical board. She could still practice elsewhere if another employer credentialed her, although Briarwood prohibited her from seeing patients there until its review was complete. When she called me after receiving the notice, she sounded less angry than I expected. They took my badge. I was sitting in my office with a stack of work I had ignored for 3 days. You're on administrative leave. I know what it's called. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Neither did I. Lillian had spent 15 years building that career. Emergency medicine suited her because she was fast, decisive, and unusually calm when everyone around her was frightened. Those qualities were part of why I loved her. They were also part of how we got here. She had looked at Brett's relapse and treated it as something she could manage privately until she reached the outcome she wanted. Treatment first. Disclosure later. When I threatened that sequence, she managed me too. I'm sorry you're losing your position, I said. She was quiet. Are you? Yes. You still think I deserve it? I think Briarwood needs to know whether it can trust you with medication safety authority. That sounded like something a lawyer wrote. It wasn't. She exhaled. They asked whether I ever suspected Brett was diverting hospital drugs before you showed me the records. What did you say? The truth. Which is, I suspected it was possible. I put down my pen. That is different from what you told me. I told you I suspected he had relapsed. You said you didn't know where he was getting it. I didn't. That isn't what I asked. She understood. I had asked whether she suspected diversion. Now she admitted she had. How long? Maybe 10 days before you found the discrepancy. Not 3 weeks. Not months. Still long enough. What made you suspect it? He called me from the hospital one night. What happened? He was high. I said nothing for a moment. You knew he was impaired inside Briarwood? I believed he was. Was he working? He said he had finished his cases. Did you verify that? No. Did you report him? No. Her voice became defensive. I drove there. I found him in the physician parking garage. I took his keys and brought him home. You brought an impaired anesthesiologist home instead of bringing the impairment to the hospital. He wasn't going back upstairs. You didn't know that. He could barely stand. That's not reassuring. Lillian started crying. I thought I had prevented the immediate danger. There was the way she still saw it. Immediate danger handled. Everything else postponed. I asked, did you look at his medication transactions after that? She hesitated. Some. My hand tightened around the phone. How? I had access to medication safety dashboards. You searched Brett's activity. Yes. And? I saw documentation variances. What kind? Late waste entries. Corrections. Cases that didn't reconcile cleanly at first. You saw the same pattern Arkwell later flagged. Not all of it. But enough. Yes. Did you open a diversion referral? No. Why? Because I thought if I started a formal referral, he would run. Run where? From treatment. From the hospital. From everyone. I looked through the glass wall of my office at Rena speaking with one of our engineers. How many times did you review his alerts? I don't remember. Briarwood will. I know. That was the first time I heard fear in her voice that was not about Brett. What did you do with them? They were not all diversion alerts. That wasn't my question. I classified some as documentation issues. My chair felt suddenly uncomfortable. You closed them? Some. How many? I don't know. You were on the medication safety committee. You suspected he was impaired. You knew he might be getting opioids at work, and you closed controlled substance discrepancies as documentation errors? I reviewed the charting. Did you speak to pharmacy? No. Did you speak to anesthesia leadership? No. Then what investigation justified closing them? Lillian stopped answering. I had spent 2 days focused on the psychiatric hold because it was the most personal violation. Now I could see what came before it. She had not suddenly panicked when I showed her a spreadsheet. She had already been absorbing warning signs into a private rescue plan. How many people knew you were helping him? 1. Who? His sister. No one at Briarwood? No. So every official system thought Brett was functioning normally while you privately knew he had relapsed. Yes. I closed my eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because I told the hospital. That was unexpected. They already know? Yes. When? This morning. Before or after they put you on leave? Before. I let that sit. Lillian had finally made one choice that did not protect herself. It did not repair what she had done. It did tell me she was beginning to understand that disclosure could not remain conditional on whether the outcome was survivable. She said, I'm not asking you to help me. Good. But there's something I need you to know. What? I did not steal anything for Brett. I never said you did. I never changed his dispensing records. I didn't say that either. And I never knew for certain he was taking fentanyl until you showed me the Arkwell pattern. I believe that too. Her responsibility was already serious enough without enlarging it. You didn't have to know everything, I said. You knew enough to stop treating it privately. She started crying again. This time I ended the call rather than repeat the argument. At 3:10, Halbert delivered its first technical findings to Briarwood. Rena was allowed to brief me only on issues that affected Arkwell. The company's system had performed correctly. The 37 transactions were genuine discrepancies, not corrupted imports. Brett's stolen badge explanation also failed to account for the medication system activity because the relevant logins required more than physical building access. His phone had been used as one authentication factor on several occasions. The credential recovery Lillian approved explained why his account remained usable after a password problem, but it did not tell investigators who physically entered the transactions. For that, Halbert needed Briarwood's local workstation data. Those records produced the first result nobody could explain as a marital dispute. 3 of the midnight edits came from a computer in the anesthesiology physician's lounge. Security access showed Brett entered the lounge within minutes of each one. On 2 nights, nobody else entered for more than an hour. The third night had several physicians present. It still was not the kind of evidence that made a criminal case by itself. It did make his stolen credential defense harder to sustain. Then Rena said, there's another category in the report. What? Prior alerts. My attention sharpened. Arkwell's reconciliation engine had not suddenly discovered all 37 anomalies on one morning. Some had generated lower-level hospital alerts when they occurred. Why weren't they escalated? That's what Halbert is asking. How many? 9. Who reviewed them? Briarwood hasn't released the employee identity to us. Can they? Outside counsel says they will if it becomes relevant to our system validation. It is relevant. I agree. She turned her laptop toward me. The audit history showed 9 early variances routed into Briarwood's medication safety review queue. Each had been opened. Each had been reviewed. Each had been closed without referral to pharmacy diversion investigators. The disposition was almost identical every time. Clinical documentation variance, no further action. I thought about my conversation with Lillian. She had just admitted closing some of Brett's alerts. How many medication safety reviewers could do that? About 12. And Lillian? Yes. I did not need to guess publicly. Halbert would establish the account. That evening, Brett's attorney made his first detailed public statement. He acknowledged Brett had struggled with prescription opioid dependence after a shoulder injury but denied he had diverted fentanyl from patients or Briarwood inventory. According to the statement, Brett had sought confidential treatment and was being turned into the target of a marital dispute involving a technology vendor with extraordinary access to hospital systems. I read it once. Then deleted the news alert. The hospital's own logs were no longer dependent on Arkwell. My recusal had done what it was supposed to do. If Brett was innocent, independent evidence could show that. If he wasn't, he could no longer make my marriage the only explanation for the data. The next morning, Naomi called before 7. Briarwood released the reviewer audit to Halbert. I sat up in the hotel bed. And? 9 prior controlled substance variances involving Brett were closed over a 7-week period. By whom? 7 by Lillian. I gripped the phone. And the other 2? A pharmacist. Both were ordinary charting errors and had supporting documentation. What about Lillian's 7? 5 had no documented follow-up beyond her review note. 2 had comments saying she spoke directly with the physician. Brett. Yes. The pattern was no longer something Lillian could describe as helping an old friend get into treatment. She had used an official safety role to keep his discrepancies from reaching the people whose job was to decide whether drugs were being diverted. Naomi continued. There's one more issue. I waited. One of those 7 alerts occurred before Brett's overdose. That changed the order completely. Lillian had told me the overdose was what made her realize his relapse had become dangerous. But she had reviewed a fentanyl discrepancy tied to him 9 days earlier. She might not have known he was stealing. She had known the hospital's controlled substance system was already raising questions about him before she found him overdosed. I called her. She answered after 4 rings. Did you close a fentanyl variance for Brett before the overdose? A long silence followed. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew how it would sound. Then tell me how it happened. Her voice was quiet. He said the waste entry was late because a resident charted under the wrong case. Did you verify that with the resident? No. Pharmacy? No. You accepted Brett's explanation? Yes. Then she said something I had not heard from her before. I wanted it to be true. That was the first answer that explained more than her actions. Lillian had not investigated Brett and reached the wrong conclusion. She had started with the conclusion she needed, that he was sick, recoverable, and still fundamentally safe, and used her authority to keep the evidence inside that story. By the time I found the larger pattern, admitting what the alerts meant would also mean admitting what she had done with them. Her false report about me had protected Brett. It had also protected her. And for the first time, I understood why she had been desperate enough to put her own husband behind a locked psychiatric door. By the time Lillian admitted she had closed 7 of Brett's controlled substance alerts, Briarwood already knew. That changed the conversation between us. There was no longer anything useful about asking whether she had made one terrible decision in our kitchen. The hospital's audit showed a sequence stretching back weeks, and every step made the next one easier for her to justify. Naomi called me shortly after 9. Halbert finished validating the alert history. Briarwood wants you available this afternoon. For an interview? No. You're still recused. They may ask you to confirm dates involving the Arkwell incident, but they don't want your technical interpretation. That was fine with me. What did they find? 2 of the 7 alerts Lillian closed contain follow-up statements that may be inaccurate. I sat forward. What statements? One says the discrepancy was confirmed with the resident assigned to the case. The other says pharmacy documentation was reviewed and the variance was attributable to late waste charting. Were those things done? Briarwood is checking. The hospital did not need long. The first resident said nobody from medication safety had contacted him about Brett's case. The pharmacist whose review was supposedly referenced had never reviewed the transaction either. Those were not vague differences in recollection. Briarwood's phone, messaging, and case review records showed no contact from Lillian to either person. Her notes had made it appear that independent verification existed when it did not. I called her. She did not answer. 20 minutes later she texted. I'm with my attorney. I'll call when I can. For once, I did not chase the conversation. At 11, Briarwood formally referred Brett's diversion case to state law enforcement and the federal controlled substance investigators who handled hospital theft involving Schedule II drugs. That decision had been expected once the workstation and inventory evidence accumulated. What happened with Lillian was less straightforward. The hospital could discipline her for closing alerts improperly. The state medical board could evaluate whether she had practiced or exercised administrative authority while protecting an impaired physician. Criminal liability required intent. A bad review was not automatically a crime. A false note could be a documentation violation without being an obstruction case. What she knew, when she knew it, and why she wrote what she wrote would decide far more than the fact that the entries were wrong. At noon, Rena came into my office carrying a sandwich I had not requested. You haven't eaten. I'm fine. That answer has never meant anything useful. She put the food on my desk. Then she said, Halbert wants to know whether Arkwell keeps historical alert notification receipts. We do. For how long? 2 years. User opens to? Yes. Her expression changed. What? They're trying to establish when Lillian first saw the alerts. That was simple. Our system recorded when a hospital reviewer opened an alert, what underlying transactions were displayed, whether attachments were expanded, and how the reviewer closed the case. It did not record what someone thought. It could show what information was available when she made the decision. I could have pulled the records in less than a minute. Instead, I called our compliance manager and told him to provide them directly to Halbert. Rena noticed. That looked painful. It was. You're doing the right thing. Please don't start. She smiled. I was going to say you look terrible. Much better. The receipts reached Halberd without passing through me. By 3, Naomi called again. Lillian opened the first alert 9 days before Brett's overdose. We know that. She did more than open it. What? She expanded the linked transaction history. I knew exactly what that screen showed. When a reviewer opened a fentanyl discrepancy, Arkwell displayed the current case and offered a 30-day comparison for the same clinician. Expanding it would have shown whether the event looked isolated or repeated. How many earlier transactions were visible? 4. I leaned back. So she saw a pattern. She saw 4 prior corrected waste events involving Brett. That does not prove she knew they were theft. I know. But it does weaken the idea that she thought she was looking at one resident charting error. That was enough. At 4:20, Lillian finally called. I need to see you. I don't think that's a good idea. My lawyer says I should not talk to you privately. For once, listen to your lawyer. I'm not asking you to help my case. Then why meet? Because there's one thing I need to say before you hear it from Briarwood. I agreed to meet in Naomi's office with both attorneys present. It felt absurd to require lawyers to speak to my wife. It also felt necessary. Lillian arrived with a personal attorney named Owen Mercer. She looked exhausted and much older than she had 4 days earlier. No scrubs. No hospital badge. She sat across from me and placed both hands on the table. I gave Briarwood a complete statement this morning. Naomi asked, is any part of that statement something you intend Mr. Mallory to rely on? No. I just want him to know what I admitted. Owen looked unhappy but did not stop her. Lillian turned to me. The first fentanyl alert came 9 days before Brett overdosed. I opened his prior transactions. I know. Her face tightened. Then you know I saw there was more than one. Yes. I called Brett. What did he tell you? That residents were entering waste late and that anesthesia was having reconciliation problems after a software update. There had been a minor update that month. Not one affecting the transactions in question. Did you ask Arkwell? No. Pharmacy? No. The residents? No. She nodded. I accepted his explanation because I wanted an explanation that let me close it. That was the same thing she had told me on the phone, only more precise. Then she addressed the false review note. I wrote that the resident had confirmed the documentation problem. I stared at her. Why? Brett told me he had spoken to him. Then write that Brett told you. I know. But you didn't. No. Why? Because if I documented that the physician under review was the only person confirming his own explanation, the alert would have stayed open. There it was. She had not merely failed to investigate. She had written the note in a way that allowed the case to close. What about the pharmacy note? Same thing. Brett told you pharmacy agreed? He said they knew anesthesia waste documentation had been messy. And you wrote that pharmacy documentation had been reviewed. Yes. Owen shifted beside her. Lillian continued anyway. I was trying to keep a formal diversion referral from starting while I convinced him to enter treatment. Naomi asked the question I was too angry to phrase carefully. At that point, did you believe Dr. Kavanaugh might be taking controlled substances from Briarwood? Lillian looked at the table. Yes. How strongly? I didn't know. I thought it was possible. Enough that you were trying to keep him away from a formal diversion investigation? Yes. My anger changed. The word possible did not help her. Hospitals did not require a committee member to prove theft before escalating repeated fentanyl discrepancies involving a physician she privately knew had relapsed. The entire point of the system was to take that decision away from personal loyalty. Then Lillian looked at me. When you showed me the 37 transactions at home, I knew the old alerts were going to come up. That was the sentence I had been waiting for. You knew Arkwell's incident would expose your review history. Yes. And that was part of why you wanted 12 hours. Yes. Owen finally said, Lillian, we need to be careful. She shook her head. No. He needs to hear this. Then she looked at me again. At first I told myself I was still protecting Brett long enough to get him into treatment. But when you called Rena and opened the formal integrity event, I knew Briarwood would audit who had reviewed the earlier alerts. The room was quiet. I knew they would find me. That changed the meaning of our kitchen argument. Her fear had not been only that Brett would lose his career. By then, reporting him also meant exposing what she had already done to protect him. You called the crisis team because you needed time to deal with your own audit trail. Lillian's eyes filled. Yes. Not entirely. But enough. I thought if Brett checked himself into treatment that morning, I could go to medication safety, disclose that I had mishandled the alerts, and frame it as a physician health failure instead of an active diversion case. Frame it? She winced. That was the word in my head. There was the decision beneath all the others. She was still planning a disclosure. Just one she could time and define herself. And I was going to ruin that. Yes. So you made me the emergency instead. Lillian started crying. I told myself you were exhausted and unstable. You knew I wasn't suicidal. Yes. Owen turned toward her. That admission clearly mattered even to her own attorney. Naomi spoke before I did. Dr. Mallory, are you saying you knowingly reported suicidal intent that Mr. Mallory had not expressed? Lillian's breathing became shallow. I took something he said about our marriage and reported it as a suicide concern. Did you believe at the time that he intended to kill himself? No. The answer landed harder than any argument we had had at home. I had known. Hearing her say it in front of counsel was different. She had used a system designed to protect people in crisis because she needed me unavailable. Owen asked for a break. Lillian refused. There's more. I almost told her I did not want more. Then she said, I did not know Brett was going to report his badge stolen. I believe you. I did warn him about Arkwell. I know. I thought he would finally surrender his privileges. He used the warning to create a defense. Yes. Did he know you had closed his alerts? Lillian hesitated. Some of them. That was important. How? I told him I was handling documentation variances while I pushed him toward treatment. So he knew you were protecting him inside the hospital system. Yes. That clarified Brett too. He had not engineered everything. He had not asked Lillian to have me committed. But he knew she was absorbing warning signs for him and continued using that protection while stealing drugs. His addiction explained why he wanted the scrutiny to disappear. It did not make him passive. Lillian's attorney finally ended the meeting. Before she left, she said, I gave Briarwood the same answers. That doesn't undo anything. I know. Why now? She looked at me. Because I spent the last 4 days trying to control what happened after every truth. I don't think I'm allowed to do that anymore. It was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of accountability. That evening, Halbert completed the physical reconciliation. The missing fentanyl was not merely an electronic discrepancy. Pharmacy purchasing, cabinet inventory, anesthesia records, and documented waste left an unexplained deficit equivalent to more than 200 standard doses across the review period. Investigators also recovered enough workstation and access data to place Brett at multiple reconciliation edits tied to those shortages. Briarwood turned the complete package over to law enforcement. The criminal investigation would now have to establish what Brett actually took and whether anyone else knowingly helped conceal it. Lillian had never handled the missing fentanyl. Her exposure came from a different set of choices: false safety documentation, concealing an impaired physician's warning signs, and knowingly using a suicide allegation to keep me from reporting what I found. Before I left Naomi's office that night, she stopped me at the elevator. There's something else you should prepare for. What? The mobile crisis call. I looked at her. What about it? Briarwood Risk Management preserves crisis intake calls when they lead to an involuntary hold. My stomach tightened. You mean Lillian's call was recorded? Yes. And investigators have requested it. For days, everyone had relied on the emergency chart summary of what my wife claimed I said. The actual call would show the words she chose before police ever arrived at our house. For Brett, the case was becoming about where the fentanyl went. For Lillian, it was becoming about whether she had deliberately turned me into a psychiatric patient to keep that question from being asked. And this time, her own voice was going to answer it. The crisis intake recording was 21 minutes long. I listened to less than 6. Naomi had arranged for my attorney to receive a copy because the recording concerned the emergency hold placed on me and was now part of Briarwood's internal review. I had the right to hear it. That did not mean I needed to hear every second of my wife describing me as a danger to myself. We sat in Naomi's office with the transcript open on a monitor. The first part was ordinary enough. Lillian identified herself as a Briarwood physician and said she was calling about her husband. The crisis clinician asked whether I had made a direct statement about suicide. Lillian answered. He said if our marriage meant this little, there was no point in going on. The clinician asked, did he say there was no point in living? Lillian paused. Then. That is how I understood it. I stared at the transcript. Naomi said nothing. The clinician asked whether I had described a plan, attempted self-harm, written a note, given away possessions, or accessed my firearm. Lillian answered no to all of them. Then came the part one had never known. The clinician said, if he is angry because of a marital argument but has made no direct suicidal statement, we may not have enough for an emergency response. Lillian replied. He hasn't slept in more than a day. He is extremely agitated, fixated on my former partner, and talking about ruining his life. The clinician asked why. Lillian said. He believes Brett is stealing fentanyl from the hospital. Nothing about Arkwell. Nothing about the 37 flagged transactions. Nothing about the fact that I had just shown her data generated by a system Briarwood itself paid my company to operate. The clinician asked whether there was evidence supporting my belief. Lillian waited several seconds. I can't evaluate that right now. That was the line that made Naomi stop the recording. She looked at me. She did not say there was no evidence. No. She avoided answering. Yes. We continued. The clinician asked whether Lillian felt physically unsafe. No. Gavin has never hit me. Has he threatened Dr. Kavanaugh? Not directly. Has he threatened you? No. Then the clinician returned to the firearm. Where is the gun? In a locked safe upstairs. Does he have the key? Yes. Has he gone near it tonight? Not that I've seen. There was still no clear basis for what happened next. Then Lillian changed the conversation. I am a physician. I know what decompensation can look like. He is not behaving like himself, and I believe he needs an emergency evaluation before he does something irreversible. Her title carried weight. I remembered the crisis worker arriving at our house already looking at me as though my explanation was part of the problem. The clinician asked one final question. If we send a team and he denies suicidal intent, are you still telling me you believe he is an immediate danger to himself? Lillian answered. Yes. Naomi stopped the audio. I did not need to hear the rest. The recording did not show a doctor confused by one ambiguous sentence. It showed Lillian repeatedly being asked whether I had actually threatened suicide and repeatedly steering the conversation back toward her medical judgment. She knew the facts were thin. She compensated with authority. I stood and walked to the window. Naomi asked, do you want a break? No. What do you want to do? That question had become easier. I want the prosecutors to have the complete recording. They will probably obtain it anyway. I know. I'm also authorizing release of the psychiatric evaluation and discharge findings. Naomi studied me. That means more of your mental health record may become part of a criminal file. I understand. Potentially discoverable later if charges are filed. I understand. It was not a sacrifice I enjoyed. I had spent less than 18 hours on a psychiatric unit, and the evaluating psychiatrist had found no basis to continue holding me. Still, there were deeply personal things in that chart because psychiatric interviews were supposed to be private. Childhood grief. Stress. Sleep. My marriage. Whether I had ever felt hopeless. Whether I had ever imagined dying. I did not want Brett's defense attorney reading any of it. I wanted even less for Lillian's false account to remain the only version preserved in an official record. Naomi prepared the authorization. I signed. That afternoon, investigators interviewed the crisis clinician who took Lillian's call. According to the summary later provided to my attorney, the clinician remembered relying heavily on Lillian's status as a physician and spouse. The clinician had no access to Arkwell's drug diversion data and did not know Lillian was personally involved in protecting the doctor I was accusing. That conflict had never been disclosed. Briarwood acted before law enforcement did. At 4:30, the hospital suspended Lillian's clinical privileges entirely. Not just her vice chair role. She could no longer practice at Briarwood pending final review. The hospital also removed her access to medication safety systems and notified the state medical board of the credentialing action, as required by its reporting obligations. Lillian called me after receiving the notice. I answered because I wanted one conversation before everything moved to lawyers. They suspended me. I heard. I can't even enter the department without permission. I did not respond. For years the emergency department had been the center of her life. She knew every nurse, every back hallway, every supply room, every physician who could be trusted during a difficult night. Now her badge would not open the staff entrance. She said, "They played part of the crisis call for me." How much? Enough. Then you know why. Yes. Her voice was different. Less defensive. I heard myself answering the clinician. I waited. She kept asking me whether you actually said you wanted to die. Yes. And I kept refusing to answer the question she was asking. That was accurate. Lillian continued. I told myself I was giving her clinical context. What were you actually doing? Getting her to reach the conclusion I needed. There was no elegant way to improve that. You knew if you said, "My husband found controlled substance discrepancies involving a physician I've been privately protecting," they wouldn't treat my call the same way. No. You knew they might treat me as a whistleblower instead of a psychiatric patient. Yes. That word caught me. Whistleblower? I know you weren't technically one yet. It's not the label that matters. I know. She was quiet. Then she said, "The hospital asked whether I want to resign my privileges voluntarily. Are you going to?" No. That surprised me. Why? Because I don't want a voluntary resignation recorded as though I left over a misunderstanding. I did not know whether that was courage or strategy. Maybe both. I told them to complete the review. That meant a formal adverse finding could follow. It would be worse for her professionally than slipping away. It was also the first time she had chosen not to control the wording of an outcome. "I have to go," I said. "Gavin." I waited. "I'm sorry I put you in that unit." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added, "I know that doesn't cover what I did." "No. I know." I ended the call. The next morning, investigators executed a search warrant at Brett's condominium. I learned because his attorney issued a statement complaining that the investigation had become excessive. The search produced no spectacular hidden stash. What mattered was smaller prescription bottles in Brett's name from multiple legitimate treatments. Naloxone. Used syringes. Several empty fentanyl vials that bore Briarwood lot markings. Those vials changed the case. Hospital fentanyl vials were not supposed to leave controlled clinical areas. Even an empty vial used for legitimate patient care should have gone into the hospital's controlled waste process. 3 recovered lot numbers matched units included in Arquel's discrepancy set. The physical evidence finally connected Brett's home to the missing inventory. He was arrested that evening after investigators interviewed him with counsel present. The charges initially filed were limited: unlawful possession of controlled substances obtained through his employment, theft of hospital medication, and falsification related to controlled substance documentation. More could be added later. His medical license was summarily suspended pending board review. I saw his booking photograph online while sitting in Arquel's conference room. Rena looked over my shoulder. "So that's it? For Brett? For the theft?" "No. The arrest proved investigators believed they had probable cause. It did not prove every missing dose belonged to him, and it did not decide what sentence he would eventually receive. But the argument that I had manufactured the entire diversion case because of jealousy was finished. Brett's own attorney changed tone within hours. No more statements about my obsession. No more references to my psychiatric hold. The defense would now focus on addiction, the amount actually taken, whether all disputed records could be attributed to Brett, and how much cooperation he might offer. That evening, Naomi called. Brett's arrest triggered another records review. What records? Communications with Lillian. I sat down. Personal? Anything related to the hospital's diversion inquiry, credential alerts, or your detention. Do they need my permission? No. Then why are you telling me? Because Brett's lawyer has approached prosecutors about cooperation. That made sense. He had far more exposure now than he had the morning he reported his badge stolen. What does he have to cooperate about? Lillian. I did not answer immediately. Naomi continued. His attorney says Brett will admit Lillian did not steal drugs or change dispensing records. But he also says she knew more about his diversion than she has admitted. How much more? That's what prosecutors are evaluating. I remembered Lillian telling me she first knew for certain only when I showed her Arquel's pattern. Brett apparently intended to challenge that timeline. Does he have proof? Messages. Of course. The 2 people involved had spent months communicating. What kind of messages? Naomi said one thread appears to show Brett telling Lillian he took fentanyl from a returned anesthesia kit after a case. My stomach tightened. When? 5 days before you found the 37 discrepancies. That was after his overdose. After Lillian had already closed several alerts. Before our kitchen argument. What did she say? Naomi read only the relevant exchange. Brett. I took 2 vials. I know how bad that sounds. I'll replace them before anyone notices. Lillian. Do not touch another cabinet. Go home. We deal with this tomorrow. The next morning, she had not reported him. Instead, another message showed her arranging the physician treatment intake she kept telling me would solve everything. The meaning was suddenly much narrower and much worse. Lillian had not merely suspected Brett might be stealing drugs by the time I confronted her. She had been told directly. I thought back to our kitchen. How long have you known he was taking drugs from the hospital? I didn't know that. That answer had been false. Naomi continued. There's another message later that day. Lillian to Brett. If you check into treatment voluntarily, I can disclose the impairment without making this about diversion first. But you have to go. There it was. Her plan, written before I ever opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Treatment first. Diversion later. Maybe. When I discovered the full transaction pattern, I had not interrupted an improvised rescue. I had threatened a plan she had already built around controlling which truth Briarwood learned first. Brett's cooperation did not reduce her responsibility. It clarified it. The next morning, prosecutors asked Lillian to surrender her phone and appear for an interview with counsel. By noon, Briarwood notified her that its internal findings would be referred to law enforcement as well as the medical board. I stood in my office reading the notice Naomi had forwarded. Brett was already in county detention awaiting a bond hearing. Lillian was still free. But the question surrounding her had changed. It was no longer whether a doctor made reckless judgment calls while trying to save an addicted colleague. Investigators now had to decide whether she knowingly concealed controlled substance theft, falsified safety reviews to prevent detection, and then used a false suicide report to stop the person who finally forced the evidence into a formal system. For the first time, prison was no longer something attached only to Brett's side of the case. Lillian's attorney asked prosecutors for a proffer before she answered questions under oath. Naomi explained it to me in one sentence. Lillian could tell investigators what happened through counsel under defined conditions while prosecutors decided whether cooperation changed how they treated her conduct. What are they offering? Nothing yet. Then why do it? Because Brett is already talking, and silence no longer protects her. I understood that. By then investigators had Brett's messages, Briarwood's alert history, the crisis call, my psychiatric evaluation, and the independent technical analysis. Lillian could still dispute intent, but she could no longer plausibly claim she knew nothing about the diversion before I confronted her. The important question was what she had done after she knew. Naomi also told me the prosecutor wanted a formal statement from me. Not about fentanyl. About the night I was committed. I met Assistant District Attorney Celia Vance in a county office the next morning with Naomi beside me. Celia was direct. I need to know what you want separated from what you can prove. That's easy. Good. Start with what your wife actually heard you say. I repeated the argument as accurately as I could. When Lillian told me I was destroying Brett before he could get treatment, I had said, if our marriage means so little that you'll protect him through this, what's the point? What's the point refer to? Our marriage. Did you say life was pointless? No. Did you tell her you wanted to die? No. Did you threaten self-harm? No. Did you threaten Dr. Kavanaugh? No. Did you possess a firearm? Yes. Locked in a safe upstairs. Had you accessed it? No. The police confirmed that? Yes. She moved to the crisis call. You've heard it? Yes. Did Dr. Mallory accurately tell the clinician that you had never directly expressed suicidal intent? She avoided saying it plainly until the clinician kept asking. Celia nodded. That is what the recording shows. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. Why did you go with the crisis team? Because refusing would have turned an evaluation into a confrontation. Lillian was a physician telling them I was unstable, armed, sleep-deprived, and fixated on her former boyfriend. I thought fighting them would make her description look more credible. You agreed to transportation. Yes. You did not agree to involuntary detention. No. Did anyone physically force you into the vehicle? No. That distinction was important. My case was not that officers had kidnapped me from my home. They responded to information they believed came from a credible source and took me for evaluation under a lawful emergency process. The problem was the information Lillian supplied to trigger that process. Celia asked, "What happened to the drug evidence because you were detained?" I explained the timeline. At home, before my phone was taken, I created the Arkwell preservation event. While I was in the unit, Lillian warned Brett that the discrepancies existed and had been preserved. 40 minutes later he reported his badge stolen. Briarwood then suspended Arkwell's access and temporarily questioned my judgment based partly on information about the psychiatric hold. Did the detention prevent the evidence from being destroyed? No. Why? Because I preserved it first. She wrote that down. That answer mattered more than I initially understood. Lillian had tried to delay a report. She had not succeeded in erasing the underlying data. Any criminal theory would have to reflect what actually happened, not what might have happened. Celia closed her folder. One more question. If Dr. Mallory had simply asked you for 12 hours and you had agreed, what would have happened? I don't know. Would Arkwell have opened the formal event? Not until I authorized it. Could source records have changed in the meantime? Routine corrections could have occurred. Some lower-level logs could eventually rotate, but 12 hours alone would not erase the entire transaction history. So the significance of her conduct is not that she nearly made all evidence vanish overnight. No. She used a false mental health allegation to keep you from acting and to buy time for Dr. Kavanaugh. Yes. And, based on the messages, for herself. Yes. Celia nodded. That is the version I can work with. I appreciated that more than an exaggerated charge. Before I left, I signed an authorization allowing investigators to use the relevant portion of my psychiatric record and a sworn statement describing the detention. That was my part. I could not decide who went to jail. I could make sure nobody had to rely on Lillian's version because I was too embarrassed to let them examine mine. 2 days later, Brett reached a cooperation agreement. He admitted stealing fentanyl from Briarwood over several months. Not every unexplained dose in Arkwell's original set could be attributed to him, but enough could. He described a pattern that was depressingly simple. He would withdraw medication legitimately for anesthesia cases, retain unused vials or portions that should have been wasted under witness, and later alter or delay reconciliation documentation to make the numbers appear consistent. When discrepancies surfaced, he gave Lillian explanations he knew she wanted to believe. He also admitted telling her directly, 5 days before my confrontation, that he had taken 2 vials. That placed her knowledge beyond dispute. What Brett did not say was just as important. Lillian never asked him to steal. She never received drugs from him. She never profited. She never altered the dispensing records herself. He also confirmed that she repeatedly urged him to enter treatment. His addiction was real. So was her attempt to save him. The crime grew from what she did to keep that rescue plan intact after she knew patients and controlled substances were involved. Lillian's proffer took place the following Monday. I was not in the room. I heard the substance afterward through Naomi because portions directly affected me. At first her attorney presented the narrowest defensible version. Lillian had exercised poor judgment while managing an impaired colleague. She had closed alerts based on explanations she accepted too readily. She had mischaracterized my statement during a stressful marital dispute. She had believed an emergency evaluation was safer than doing nothing. Then Celia played 3 pieces of evidence. Not every email. Not the entire crisis call. 3. The message from Brett admitting, "I took 2 vials." Lillian's response telling him not to touch another cabinet. The crisis clinician asking whether I had directly expressed suicidal intent. And Lillian answering that she still believed I was in immediate danger even though she had no plan, threat, weapon access, or direct statement to support it. Then prosecutors showed her the 7 closed alerts. Her attorney asked for a break. When Lillian returned, she changed her account. She admitted she knew Brett had taken hospital fentanyl before I confronted her. She admitted she had intentionally written 2 review notes more strongly than the facts supported so the alerts could be closed. She admitted she wanted Brett in treatment before diversion investigators became involved because she feared formal exposure would make him run. Then she admitted why my Arkwell report changed everything. Once I created the integrity event, she knew the hospital would audit the earlier alerts and discover her involvement. She wanted time to get Brett into treatment and disclose the situation herself before Arkell's report defined it. That was why she called the crisis team. Celia asked whether she believed I intended suicide when she made the call. Lillian said no. Her attorney could not take that answer back. Nor, according to Naomi, did he try. The proffer ended with prosecutors discussing possible charges rather than an immediate arrest. That surprised people online later. It did not surprise me. Lillian was represented by counsel, had surrendered her phone, and was not a flight risk. There was no need for police to drag her from a hospital hallway to make the consequences real. Briarwood acted first. Its medical executive committee completed the portion of the review concerning patient safety and administrative conduct. Lillian's privileges were revoked. The formal findings were concise. She failed to escalate credible evidence of physician impairment and possible drug diversion, closed safety alerts without required verification, documented follow-up that had not occurred, and used her professional standing during a personal conflict without disclosing the underlying conflict. The state medical board opened its own proceeding. I did not read the hospital's full report. I already knew what she had done. That evening Lillian called. Her voice sounded flat. Briarwood revoked me. I heard. My lawyer thinks the board will suspend my license before the hearing. I did not know what to say. She saved me the trouble. I keep wanting to tell you Brett was sick. He was. And that I was trying to save him. You were. That used to feel like the most important part. What does it feel like now? Like the reason I kept giving myself permission. I did not answer. She continued. When he told me about the vials, I should have reported it that night. Yes. I thought one more morning could get him into treatment. Yes. When you found the larger pattern, I thought one more night could let me fix what I'd already hidden. Her breathing caught. And then I decided one night of your freedom was something I could spend too. That was the first time she described it without asking me to weigh her intention against the consequence. I'm sorry, she said. I believed that she was. It did not make me want to go home. Lillian, I've retained a divorce attorney. She went quiet. When are you filing? This week. Is there anything I can do that would change that? No. Her answer took several seconds. Then. Okay. She did not ask again. 3 days later, Celia called Naomi and requested another meeting. This time she had charging decisions. Brett would plead guilty to felony theft of controlled substances, possession obtained through fraud or diversion, and falsification of hospital drug records. His cooperation would be considered at sentencing, as would his addiction and decision to enter treatment while in custody. Lillian's case was different. Prosecutors were preparing charges based on knowingly false entries in hospital safety records, concealment intended to delay the controlled substance investigation, and the false information she supplied to trigger my emergency detention. Celia would not promise prison. That would be up to a judge after conviction or plea, guided by the charges, her history, the harm caused, and any agreement. I understood. The title of a court case was not a sentence. Then Celia said, "There is one problem we need to resolve before filing." What? Dr. Mallory's defense is going to argue that whatever she did with the alert records, the emergency evaluation was still an independent medical decision made by another physician. That doctor signed the hold. Yes. And? We need to separate the hospital's lawful decision based on the information it received from her liability for knowingly supplying false or materially misleading information. That sounds right. It also means your testimony matters. I already gave a statement. I mean in court. The room seemed suddenly colder. If this goes to trial, are you willing to testify about the marriage argument, your mental health history as relevant to the evaluation, and the exact words you used? I knew what that would mean. Defense counsel could question me. The psychiatric chart could be discussed in open court within whatever limits the judge allowed. My most private night could become the most public part of the case. I also knew what happened if I refused. The prosecution would still have the recording and other witnesses. But Lillian's attorneys would have more room to argue that the difference between what I meant and what she understood was impossible to establish beyond a marital disagreement. I'll testify. Naomi looked at me. You don't have to answer immediately. I already know. Celia nodded and closed her folder. When I returned to Arkwell, Rena asked how the meeting went. They're filing. Against both? Yes. She studied my face. You okay? No. Then I went back to work. The next morning, Dr. Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Lillian Mallory were formally charged in separate cases arising from the same months of concealed drug diversion. Brett had stolen the fentanyl. Lillian had tried to keep the theft inside a private rescue plan until she could control the consequences. When that plan began collapsing, she used me as the delay. Now neither of them could decide the timing anymore. A court would. Lillian's lawyers had one way to make her case look smaller. They could make mine look bigger. Naomi explained it to me 3 weeks after the charges were filed, when the first defense motions arrived. Lillian was not denying that she had mishandled Brett's alerts. She was not denying that she knew about the 2 fentanyl vials before I confronted her. She was not even trying to retract what she told prosecutors during the proffer. Her defense focused on the psychiatric hold. The argument was straightforward. Lillian had called the crisis line. A licensed clinician evaluated the call. Police and a mobile crisis team came to the house. A separate emergency physician evaluated me. That physician, not Lillian, signed the temporary hold. Then an independent psychiatrist released me the next morning. Her attorneys wanted to argue that even if Lillian had overstated what I said, several professionals made their own decisions after observing me. If those decisions were independent, prosecutors would have a harder time proving that Lillian knowingly caused an unlawful detention rather than simply supplied information during a chaotic marital crisis. The legal argument did not offend me. The next part did. Her lawyers subpoenaed my complete psychiatric chart. Not just the intake notes from that night. Every relevant behavioral health record Briarwood possessed, including older counseling records that had been imported into its system after my mother died and I briefly saw a therapist in college. I stared at the subpoena. They want records from 25 years ago. They want anything that could support a history of depression, suicidal thinking, impulsivity, or emotional instability. I was 19. I know. My mother had died. I know. What does that have to do with whether Lillian lied on the crisis call? Potentially very little. That's why we're moving to limit it. Naomi had already prepared the motion. She thought the judge would restrict the defense to records genuinely relevant to the emergency evaluation and my state of mind around the incident. Still, the message was obvious. If I testified, Lillian's defense was prepared to explore whether I had ever been depressed enough that her fear could be called reasonable. I called her that evening. Our lawyers had advised limited direct contact, but neither had prohibited it. She answered quietly. "Gavin, did you authorize your lawyers to subpoena my old mental health records?" A long pause followed. "They told me it was standard." "That isn't what I asked. I signed off on the defense strategy." "Did you know they were going back to college?" "Not specifically. But you knew they were going to argue you had reasons to think I might be suicidal." "Yes." I walked to the window of my office. "Did you have those reasons?" "No." She answered too quickly for there to be any room left. "Then why let them do it?" "Because my lawyer said the prosecution is turning the detention into an intentional act, and we have to show the hospital made its own assessment. You can argue that without turning my mother's death into evidence." "I know." "Do you?" She started crying. "I am facing prison." "I know. My license is already suspended. Briarwood revoked my privileges. I may never practice emergency medicine again." "I know. And my lawyer is telling me that if the detention charge sticks the way prosecutors are framing it, the sentencing exposure gets much worse." That was honest. It was also the first time since the kitchen that I heard the old instinct return so clearly. The outcome frightened her. A boundary stood between her and the outcome she wanted. So the boundary began looking negotiable. I said, "You admitted you didn't believe I was suicidal." "Yes." "You admitted you withheld the reason I was angry." "Yes." "You admitted you wanted me unavailable while you got Brett into treatment and dealt with the audit." "Yes." "Then if your defense is that maybe I was unstable enough for your lie not to matter, you are doing the same thing again." She stopped crying. I continued. "You know what happened. You're just looking for a version that costs you less." She did not answer. I ended the call. The next morning Naomi told me something I did not expect. Lillian had withdrawn the broad subpoena. "What?" "Her lawyer filed an amended request limited to your emergency evaluation, the crisis team documentation, and records from the 72 hours surrounding the hold." "Why?" "She instructed them to." I sat back. Did prosecutors offer something? Not that I know of. Then why would she weaken her own defense? Naomi looked at me for a moment. "You'd have to ask her." I didn't. For once, I let the decision stand without demanding an explanation. The judge later approved a narrow evidentiary order. The defense could question me about my sleep deprivation, the argument, my exact words, the firearm in the house, and what the responding clinicians observed. They could not turn decades of unrelated counseling into a character trial. That did not make testifying pleasant. My deposition lasted nearly 4 hours. Lillian sat beside her attorneys across the table. She looked at me only when I described the kitchen. Her lawyer, Daniel Wexler, was professional. He asked whether I had slept. No. How long had you been awake? Approximately 28 hours. Were you angry? Yes. Did you raise your voice? Yes. Did you say Dr. Kavanaugh was finished? Yes. Did you tell your wife your marriage had become pointless? I said, if our marriage means this little, what's the point? Could someone interpret that as hopelessness? In a marriage, yes. In life? That is not what I meant. But Dr. Mallory could not read your mind. No. Wexler nodded. Then Naomi slid him the crisis call transcript. He already knew what came next. The clinician asked your client whether I had directly expressed suicidal intent, I said. She knew I hadn't. Wexler did not argue with me. He moved on. That was the strength and weakness of Lillian's defense. Nobody needed to prove she knew every thought in my head. The recording showed what she knew about my words. And her own proffer showed why she wanted the evaluation to happen. After the deposition, Lillian approached me in the hallway while our attorneys packed. Gavin. I stopped. She held a folder. What is that? My proposed plea. I looked at her. You have one? Prosecutors sent terms yesterday. I did not ask what they were. She told me anyway. If Lillian pleaded guilty to falsifying hospital safety records and knowingly making materially false statements that led to my emergency psychiatric detention, prosecutors would dismiss a broader obstruction count that carried more uncertain proof. She would also admit, in the plea record, that she knew Brett had taken hospital fentanyl before my Arkwell report and intentionally delayed escalation. There was no promise of probation. The agreement allowed prosecutors to seek jail. Her attorney could ask for home confinement or community supervision based on her lack of criminal history, cooperation, and career loss. What are you going to do? Accept it. I studied her face. Because of the subpoena? Partly. She looked down the hallway. I saw what my defense would require me to become. I waited. If I wanted to convince a jury I acted reasonably, I would have to make them doubt you. That is what defense lawyers do. I know. You're entitled to defend yourself. I know that too. She looked at me. But I would be asking strangers to believe the thing I already admitted was false, that I genuinely thought you might kill yourself. There was nothing I needed to add. Lillian continued. My lawyer can argue independent medical judgment. That part is real. The emergency physician made his own decision. Yes. But I gave him a version of the facts designed to push him toward that decision. Yes. I'm done pretending that distinction erases what I did. Her choice did not make her noble. She was accepting responsibility after the evidence had already cornered her. But she was finally refusing to buy a better outcome by spending another piece of me. 2 days later, Lillian entered her guilty plea. I did not attend. I was at Arkwell when Naomi texted that the judge had accepted it. The factual basis was public by lunchtime. Lillian admitted that she had knowingly documented unverified information in controlled substance safety reviews involving Brett, failed to escalate known diversion concerns, and materially misrepresented my statements and the context of our argument during the crisis call. Her medical license remained suspended pending the board's final action. Brett's plea followed the next week. He admitted stealing fentanyl from Briarwood and falsifying controlled substance documentation to conceal the missing medication. His cooperation narrowed the number of theft transactions prosecutors attributed directly to him, but the quantity was still substantial. He would be sentenced first. Lillian would follow 11 days later. The two cases had finally separated into what each of them actually did. Brett stole the drugs. Lillian protected him after she knew. When I forced the issue into a formal system, she used that same system against me. Now sentencing would determine how much of their lives the state would take in return. That was not mine to decide. What I still had to decide was whether I wanted to stand in the courtroom when Lillian heard the answer. Brett was sentenced on a Monday morning. I did not attend. By then I had heard enough about the mechanics of his addiction to understand what he had done without needing to watch a judge describe it again. Naomi sent me the result afterward. Brett received 4 years in state prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory substance abuse treatment. His cooperation had reduced the sentence prosecutors requested, but the judge refused probation because he had repeatedly taken fentanyl entrusted to him for patient care and altered records to hide it. His medical license was already suspended. Whether he ever practiced again was no longer a question I cared about. Lillian's sentencing was 11 days later. That one I attended. Not because I wanted to watch her suffer. I needed to hear what happened when every excuse had finally been stripped away and the only thing left was responsibility. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Lillian sat beside Daniel Wexler in a dark gray suit. Her hair was tied back, and for the first time in 15 years I saw her enter a room without anyone recognizing her as the doctor in charge. Her parents sat behind her. I sat with Naomi on the opposite side. Lillian looked at me once when I entered. I nodded. She nodded back. Then we both faced forward. The prosecutor spoke first. Celia did not portray Lillian as someone who had planned Brett's theft or profited from it. She made that distinction clearly. Lillian had tried to help an addicted physician she had once loved. The crime came from what she did after helping him required her to override systems designed to protect other people. She closed controlled substance alerts without required verification. She wrote documentation that made unconfirmed explanations appear independently checked. She knew Brett had taken fentanyl from the hospital and still delayed formal reporting. Then, when I found the larger pattern and moved to preserve it, she knowingly gave crisis staff a distorted account of my words so I would be removed from the situation. Celia played only one short portion of the crisis call. The clinician asked, "Did he directly say he intended to harm himself?" Lillian answered, "Not in those words." Then came the question that mattered. "Do you still believe he is an immediate danger to himself?" "Yes." The recording stopped. Nobody needed the other 20 minutes. Celia told the judge that the psychiatric hold had lasted less than a day and that I had been released after independent evaluation. She also acknowledged that police, crisis staff, and the emergency physician acted under procedures they believed were appropriate based on the information they received. Then she said, "The defendant's professional authority did not give her the power to decide that her husband's liberty was an acceptable tool for managing another physician's drug problem." That was the entire case in one sentence. Wexler asked for probation with home confinement. His argument was not ridiculous. Lillian had no criminal history. She had cooperated once the evidence became undeniable. She had surrendered her phone voluntarily. She had pleaded guilty rather than force me through a public trial. She had lost Briarwood, her leadership position, and almost certainly her medical career. She had spent years treating people in emergencies and had letters from nurses, patients, and physicians describing lives she had helped save. All of that was true. Wexler also emphasized that she had not intended to keep me hospitalized for weeks or months. She wanted time. The judge interrupted him. "How much?" Wexler stopped. "Your Honor, how much of another person's liberty may someone knowingly obtain through false information before it becomes serious enough for incarceration?" Wexler did not answer immediately. "I'm not suggesting there is an acceptable amount." "Then be careful with an argument that sounds like duration is doing the moral work." Lillian lowered her head. Wexler changed direction. He argued that incarceration was unnecessary to protect the public because Lillian had already lost access to the systems she abused and had demonstrated acceptance of responsibility by abandoning the broader attack on my psychiatric history. The judge listened. Then he asked whether I wanted to speak. I stood. My statement was less than 2 pages. I did not talk about Brett much. His case had already been decided. I described being told to surrender my phone, belt, keys, and shoelaces because my wife had used her credibility as a physician to make people believe I might kill myself. I described how difficult it was to explain a controlled substance anomaly while knowing that every attempt to insist I was right could be interpreted as further evidence that I was fixated. Then I told the judge what had mattered most after I was released. For several days, I thought my wife had done this entirely to protect Dr. Kavanaugh. I later learned that by the time I found the full drug pattern, reporting him would also expose records she had already closed. I was not just threatening the person she was trying to save. I was threatening the version of events she still believed she could control. I looked at Lillian. She was crying silently. I don't believe she wanted me permanently harmed. I believe she convinced herself that one night of my freedom was temporary enough to spend. I returned to my seat. Lillian spoke last. She did not give the courtroom a long explanation of addiction, hospital culture, or how badly she wanted Brett to enter treatment. She had already used those explanations for months. Instead, she stood and said, "I knew my husband had not threatened suicide. I gave the crisis team information that made them believe he had because I wanted him stopped before he reported something I had already mishandled." The courtroom stayed still. I was a doctor. I knew people would trust my judgment. I used that trust for myself. She looked toward me. "I cannot repair what happened by explaining why I was afraid." Then she sat down. That was all. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in county custody, with 12 months to be served and the remainder suspended under supervised probation. Wexler had asked for home confinement. Celia had requested incarceration. The judge chose jail. He said Lillian's medical career and prior public service mattered, but so did the deliberate misuse of professional credibility against someone whose freedom depended on strangers believing her account. A deputy approached the defense table. For the first time since I had known her, Lillian looked frightened in a way she could not solve by taking charge. She removed her watch and handed it to her mother. Then she turned toward me. I did not smile. I did not look away. The deputy placed her in handcuffs and led her through the side door. Brett was already serving his sentence. Now Lillian was behind a locked door too. The difference mattered to me. I had entered one because she lied about me. She entered hers after admitting what she had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. Naomi guided me toward the side exit. One of them shouted, "Mr. Mallory, do you feel vindicated?" I kept walking. The word did not fit. My company was safe. The drug diversion had been proved. The psychiatric record no longer described my accusation as an unexplained fixation. The people responsible had been convicted. None of that made the night inside Briarwood disappear. 3 days later, I signed the final divorce settlement. Lillian had agreed to everything before sentencing. There was no fight over the house, no attempt to use the criminal case as leverage, and no request that I wait until she was released. I kept the house. We divided the accounts. Her personal property was already stored with her parents. The only item left was her wedding ring. Her mother brought it to Naomi's office in a small envelope. There was no note. I carried it home and placed it beside mine in the kitchen drawer. That should have been the end of it. 2 weeks into Lillian's sentence, I received a letter from her. I almost gave it to Naomi unopened. Then I saw the first line through the thin paper. "I'm not asking you to wait for me." I read the rest. It was short. She wrote that jail was loud at night and strangely quiet during the hours when everyone else seemed to be sleeping. She had spent most of her adult life being useful to people in emergencies, and now there was almost nothing she could fix. She did not ask whether I still loved her. She did not ask for another chance. She wrote about one thing. The morning after I was committed, she had stood outside the psychiatric unit while Dr. Boone prepared to discharge me. Lillian had still believed she could explain everything if she just got Brett into treatment first. Then she watched me walk out carrying my shoes and a plastic bag containing my own belongings. Only later did she understand what that image meant. She had turned her husband into a problem the hospital had to process. The final paragraph said, "I kept calling what I did help because I was afraid of calling it control. You were the person who finally refused to let me rename it. I'm sorry." I folded the letter. That night, I drove to the house we had shared and opened the safe upstairs. The gun was still inside exactly where it had been when police came. Beside it was the access log showing that the door had not been opened that night. I no longer needed the photograph I had taken after my release. I deleted it. Then I went downstairs and opened the kitchen drawer. 2 wedding rings sat beside each other. For a moment I remembered Lillian before Brett, before Briarwood's drug alerts, before any of this. The doctor who once drove through a snowstorm to sit with me when Dad had surgery. The woman who slept on my office floor during Arkwell's first product launch because I had been awake for 2 days and she refused to leave me alone. Those memories were real. So was the woman who had looked at a crisis system built to protect vulnerable people and decided she could use it to buy herself one more night. I closed the drawer. The divorce would become final while Lillian was still serving her sentence. I did not visit her. I did not answer the letter. There was nothing left I needed her to explain. Months earlier, She had tried to make a hospital believe I could not trust my own mind. In the end, the records did exactly what good records are supposed to do. They outlasted fear. They outlasted loyalty. They outlasted the stories people told when the truth became inconvenient. And when the doors finally closed on Brett and Lillian, it was not because I had destroyed them. It was because, once every record was preserved and every excuse had been stripped away, both of them had to answer for what they had chosen to do. That's all for today. Remember to subscribe and support us.